There exists a photograph, buried in the archives of the Nuremberg trials, that even seasoned historians hesitate to describe in detail. It shows a German SS officer, a man who had overseen executions across occupied Poland, standing rigid with his face turned away from something happening just outside the frame. His report to Berlin, written 3 days later, contains a single underlined sentence that would be repeated in dozens of similar documents over the following months: "The Croatian methods exceed all boundaries of military necessity and approach something I can only describe as religious madness." This is the story of the regime that made monsters feel like witnesses to something worse than themselves. The spring of 1941 arrived in the Balkans like a fever dream. Yugoslavia, that patchwork kingdom stitched together after the First Great War, was tearing itself apart under the weight of German invasion. Within 11 days, the country ceased to exist as a political entity. In its place, occupying powers carved out territories like butchers dividing a carcass. And in one of those territories, in the ancient lands of Croatia, something began to take shape that would horrify even the architects of industrial genocide. To understand what happened in Croatia between 1941 and 1945, you must first understand that this was not merely a puppet state following orders from Berlin or Rome. This was something far stranger, far more intimate in its violence. The Independent State of Croatia, as it called itself, was led by a movement called the Ustashe, a word that roughly translates to the insurgents or those who stand up. But standing up is not what they did. What they did was descend into a kind of systematic brutality that operated according to its own internal logic, a logic that seemed to blend Catholic mysticism, ethnic hatred, and something that can only be described as a death cult mentality. The man who led this regime was Ante Pavelić, a lawyer by training and a fanatic by temperament. He had spent the 1930s in exile, harbored by Mussolini's Italy, dreaming of an independent Croatian state purified of its Serbian, Jewish, and Roma populations. When the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, Pavelić returned home with his blackshirt legions, armed not just with Italian weapons but with a vision of Croatia as a Catholic fortress, racially pure, spiritually awakened, and willing to do whatever necessary to achieve that awakening. What he created instead was a laboratory of cruelty that would shock even the most hardened observers of World War II's countless horrors. The Ustashe did not come to power through popular revolution. They came to power through convenience. Hitler and Mussolini needed someone to manage the Croatian territories, and Pavelić was available, eager, and utterly without moral restraint. On April 10, 1941, he proclaimed the Independent State of Croatia from the steps of the band's palace in Zagreb. Within hours, the killing began. But these were not the methodical, bureaucratic killings that characterized the Nazi final solution. These were personal, intimate, almost ritualistic murders that seemed designed not just to eliminate enemies but to transform the killers themselves. The Ustashe wore black uniforms and carried a distinctive weapon that would become their symbol, a long curved knife worn at the belt, called a Srbosjek, which translates literally as Serb-cutter. This was not standard military equipment. This was a statement. The knife had a leather loop that fitted over the hand, with the blade extending forward from the fist like a grotesque extension of the arm itself. It was designed for close-quarters killing, for looking into the eyes of the victim, for making murder a physical, exhausting, blood-soaked experience. And the Ustashe used these knives constantly, preferring them over guns in many situations, turning execution into a kind of manual labor. In the early weeks of Ustashe rule, Serbian villages across Croatia and Bosnia began to empty. Not through evacuation or flight, but through annihilation. The pattern was almost always the same. Ustashe militia would arrive in a village at night, surround it, and then go house to house with their knives, clubs, and axes. They killed entire families in their homes, in front of each other, often with a deliberateness that suggested something beyond military objectives. Survivors who managed to escape into the forests would later describe scenes that sound like something from medieval chronicles: bodies piled in village squares, children thrown into burning buildings, pregnant women cut open, Orthodox priests tortured for hours before being killed. But these village massacres, horrific as they were only the beginning. The Ustashe leadership had a larger vision. They established a network of concentration camps across the territory, the largest and most notorious being Jasenovac, a sprawling complex of barracks, warehouses, and killing fields located at the confluence of the Sava and Una rivers, about 60 miles south of Zagreb. Jasenovac was not modeled on German concentration camps. It was something uniquely Croatian, uniquely Ustashe. It combined elements of a labor camp, an extermination center, and what can only be described as an experimental theater of cruelty. The commandant of Jasenovac for much of its operation was a man named Vjekoslav Ljuburek, known universally as Max. Before the war, Ljuburek had been a law student and a street brawler for the Ustashe movement. Under Pavelić's regime, he became the architect of Croatia's most efficient killing operation. But efficient is perhaps the wrong word. The murders at Jasenovac were rarely efficient in the industrial sense. They were labor-intensive, physically exhausting, and seemingly designed to maximize both the suffering of the victims and the psychological transformation of the perpetrators. Prisoners arrived at Jasenovac in cattle cars, just as they did at Auschwitz or Treblinka. But what happened next was different. There were no gas chambers at Jasenovac. There were no industrial facilities for mass murder. Instead, there were barracks where prisoners were worked to death, execution grounds where they were killed in batches with hammers, knives, and axes, and a brick factory with enormous ovens where bodies were disposed of. The killing was intimate, manual, face-to-face. Guards would select groups of prisoners each night, march them to the banks of the Sava River, and butcher them in full view of other prisoners who would be forced to dispose of the bodies the next morning. The German presence in Croatia was substantial throughout the war. Wehrmacht units, SS detachments, and German administrative personnel were everywhere, working alongside their Croatian allies. And they noticed immediately that something was wrong. These were not men unfamiliar with atrocity. Many had served on the Eastern Front. Many had participated in or witnessed mass executions. But what was happening in Croatia disturbed them at a fundamental level. The first reports back to Berlin began arriving in the summer of 1941, just months after the Ustashe took power. A German general named Edmund Glaise von Horstenow, assigned as Hitler's military plenipotentiary to Croatia, wrote a dispatch describing Ustashe methods as savage and bestial. He noted that Ustashe militia were conducting massacres, with such enthusiasm that it suggests pathological motivation rather than political necessity. Another German officer, observing Ustashe operations in Bosnia, wrote that the Croatian forces were completely out of control and engaged in orgies of murder that served no strategic purpose and were in fact counterproductive, driving potential collaborators into the arms of the partisan resistance. But the most telling reports came from SS officers, men who were themselves implementing the Holocaust across Eastern Europe. An SS officer named Hermann Neubacher, who served as special plenipotentiary for the Southeast, wrote after the war that the Ustashe atrocities were the most bestial massacres of the war. An Einsatzgruppen officer who visited Jasenovac in 1942 filed a report stating that the camp's methods were unnecessarily brutal, and that the guards appeared to take sadistic pleasure in the killings in a way that was unbecoming of soldiers. These reports accumulated in Berlin throughout 1942 and 1943, painting a picture of a regime that had somehow exceeded the already bottomless capacity for cruelty that characterized the Nazi state. What was happening? How had the Ustashe managed to shock men who were themselves orchestrating genocide? The answer lies partly in the religious dimension of Ustashe ideology. This was not simply ethnic cleansing or political murder. This was, in the minds of many Ustashe leaders, a holy war. The regime presented itself as the defender of Catholic Croatia against Orthodox Serbia, against Jewish influence, against all the forces that had supposedly corrupted Croatian purity. Ante Pavelić met regularly with Catholic clergy, some of whom actively supported the regime. Most notoriously, a Franciscan friar named Miroslav Filipović served as a commandant at Jasenovac for several months, personally participating in mass executions while still wearing his clerical robes. The involvement of clergy gave the violence a ritualistic quality. Prisoners at Jasenovac reported being forced to convert to Catholicism before execution, as if their murders were acts of purification rather than simple killing. Ustashe guards would sometimes sing religious hymns while conducting massacres. There are documented cases of Orthodox churches being burned with their congregations locked inside, a medieval form of religious warfare reappearing in the 20th century. The regime even minted coins and issued stamps depicting Catholic symbols alongside Ustashe insignia, creating a visual language that merged religious and political violence into a single totemic system. But beyond the religious veneer, there was something else at work, something that German observers struggled to articulate in their reports. The Ustashe seemed to kill not out of cold ideology or bureaucratic duty, but out of something closer to ecstasy. Guards at Jasenovac were known to compete with each other over who could kill the most prisoners in a single night. There are records of betting pools, of guards wagering on their efficiency, of informal contests where the winner received extra rations or a bottle of plum brandy. One guard, a man named Petr Brzica, allegedly killed over 1,000 prisoners in a single night using only a knife, a claim that was recorded in multiple testimonies and later used as evidence at his trial. This competitive element, this transformation of murder into sport, was something that Nazi observers found particularly disturbing. The German approach to genocide, for all its evil, was framed as a necessary duty, a difficult task that had to be completed for the sake of racial hygiene and national security. The killers were supposed to be soldiers following orders, not enthusiasts. But the Ustashe seemed to revel in their work. They took photographs of their victims, posed with bodies, sent images back to their families as if documenting hunting trips. They created a culture where cruelty was not just accepted but celebrated, where the ability to kill without hesitation or remorse was a mark of status and belonging. The German military administration in Croatia found itself in an impossible position. They needed the Ustashe to maintain control of the territory and to combat the growing partisan resistance. But the Ustashe methods were so extreme that they were actively fueling that resistance. Every village massacre created more recruits for Tito's communist partisans. Every atrocity drove more of the population into opposition. The Germans tried repeatedly to rein in the Ustashe, to impose some kind of rational calculation on their violence. But Pavelić and his inner circle were beyond such considerations. They had created a regime whose very identity was built on transgression, on proving Croatian toughness through increasingly extreme acts of cruelty. By 1943, the situation had deteriorated to the point where German officers were openly criticizing their Croatian allies in official communications. One Wehrmacht report from that year described the Ustashe as a gang of criminals whose methods were unprecedented in their bestiality. Another German document recommended that Croatian forces be disarmed and replaced with German units because they could no longer be trusted to conduct operations without devolving into pointless massacres. But these recommendations were never implemented. Germany needed every available ally, no matter how problematic, to hold the Balkans against the advancing Red Army and the increasingly effective partisan forces. The camps continued to operate. Jasenovac expanded. New sub-camps were established. The killing accelerated. And through it all, the Ustashe maintained their distinctive approach, personal and intimate, face-to-face and blood-soaked. Prisoners who survived later testified about the psychological atmosphere in the camps, describing guards who seemed to exist in a permanent state of frenzy, who would suddenly grab prisoners and beat them to death for no reason, who seemed to need violence the way others need food or sleep. One survivor described watching a guard kill a child by swinging it by its legs and smashing its head against a wall, and then immediately sitting down to eat lunch as if nothing had happened, as if the murder had been no more significant than swatting a fly. There were women among the Ustashe perpetrators, something that was unusual even in the broader context of World War II atrocities. Female guards at Jasenovac and other camps participated fully in the violence, sometimes with even more enthusiasm than their male counterparts. The most infamous was a woman named Nada Sakic, who served as a guard and later as an overseer at Jasenovac's children's camp. Survivors described her as pathologically cruel, torturing children for entertainment, beating infants to death, throwing live prisoners into the brick factory ovens. After the war, she fled to Austria and then to the United States, where she lived quietly for decades before being discovered, extradited, and tried. She showed no remorse, insisting until her death that the prisoners at Jasenovac deserved their fate. The precise death toll at Jasenovac remains contested even today. The Yugoslav communist government after the war claimed over 700,000 victims. Serbian nationalist historians have claimed even higher numbers. Croatian nationalist historians have argued for much lower figures, sometimes as low as 40 or 50,000. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates between 77,000 and 99,000 deaths at Jasenovac alone, with total Ustashe killings across all camps and operations reaching somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000. But these numbers, as staggering as they are, cannot capture the qualitative dimension of what occurred. This was not factory killing. This was intimate murder, repeated thousands of times, performed by people who had transformed themselves into something monstrous. The partisan resistance in Yugoslavia grew stronger throughout 1943 and 1944, fed by Ustashe atrocities and unified under Tito's communist leadership. By late 1944, the Ustashe regime was collapsing. German forces were withdrawing from the Balkans. Partisan units were liberating territories. And the perpetrators knew what was coming. Many Ustashe leaders, including Pavelić himself, began preparing escape routes. They gathered valuables looted from victims, established contacts with sympathetic clergy who could provide false documents, and planned their flights to South America, Spain, or Austria. In April 1945, as Soviet and partisan forces closed in on Zagreb, the Ustashe leadership ordered the final liquidation of Jasenovac. Guards executed the remaining prisoners, set fire to the camp buildings, and attempted to destroy evidence. But they ran out of time. Partisan forces liberated the smoldering ruins on April 22, 1945. What they found defied description. Mass graves. Scattered human remains. Ovens still containing bones. And testimonies from the few survivors, testimonies so graphic and disturbing that even hardened partisan soldiers struggled to process what they were hearing. Ante Pavelić escaped. He made it to Austria, then to Italy, where he was sheltered by Catholic clergy for several years before eventually fleeing to Argentina. He lived in Buenos Aires under a false identity, along with other Ustashe leaders and Nazi war criminals, protected by the Perón regime. He died in Spain in 1959 from wounds sustained in an assassination attempt by a Yugoslav agent 2 years earlier. He never faced trial. He never showed remorse. He spent his final years writing memoirs that glorified the Ustashe regime and denied the extent of its crimes. Many other Ustashe perpetrators also escaped. Some made it to South America. Some hid in monasteries across Europe. Some reinvented themselves with new identities and lived quiet lives until death. Others were captured, tried by Yugoslav courts, and executed. But the full accounting never happened. Thousands of perpetrators, from camp commandants to village militia members, simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. They became truck drivers, shopkeepers, factory workers. They had children and grandchildren who knew nothing of their pasts. They died in their beds, having escaped justice entirely. The German reports about Ustashe atrocities, those documents that had accumulated in Berlin throughout the war, were captured by Allied forces and used as evidence at Nuremberg. They proved useful in establishing the broader context of Nazi collaboration, but they also revealed something uncomfortable. They showed that even the Nazi state, even the SS, even the Einsatzgruppen, could be shocked by cruelty when it exceeded their own carefully constructed framework of industrial murder. The Germans could rationalize genocide when it was framed as hygiene, as necessity, as difficult duty. But they struggled to rationalize what the Ustashe did, that ecstatic, ritualistic, almost worshipful approach to murder. In the decades after the war, Yugoslavia under Tito suppressed detailed discussion of the Ustashe period. It was politically inconvenient to emphasize ethnic violence when the regime was trying to build a unified multi-ethnic state. Jasenovac became a memorial site, but a carefully managed one, where the specific Croatian and Catholic dimensions of the perpetrators were downplayed in favor of a narrative about fascism in general. Survivors struggled to tell their stories. Many didn't want to remember. Many couldn't find the words. The full truth began to emerge only in the 1980s and 1990s, as Yugoslavia collapsed and ethnic tensions reignited. Historians gained access to archives. Survivors felt safe enough to speak. And the world began to understand that during World War II, in a corner of Europe that most people couldn't locate on a map, something had happened that defied easy categorization. Not quite genocide in the bureaucratic Nazi sense. Not quite ethnic cleansing in the cold strategic sense. But something stranger and darker, a kind of mass possession, a death cult that had dressed itself in the symbols of civilization while conducting a carnival of cruelty. There is a photograph, taken by a German soldier in Bosnia in the summer of 1942. It shows a group of Ustashe militia standing in a village square. They are smiling. Their uniforms are stained dark with blood. Behind them, barely visible in the photograph's background, are bodies piled against a stone wall. The bodies are small. Children. The photograph was included in a report filed with Wehrmacht headquarters, accompanied by a note that simply read, "The Croatians are beyond control. Recommend immediate German supervision of all security operations." That photograph circulated through military channels, was filed in an archive, was captured by American forces, was catalogued, was occasionally reproduced in history books, and exists today in digital form, accessible to anyone willing to search for it. But most people don't search. Most people don't want to know about Jasenovac, about the Srbosjek knives, about the competitions, about the clergy in blood-stained robes, about any of it. It's too much. It's too close to something we don't want to acknowledge about human nature. Because the Ustashe were not inhuman. That's the terrible truth. They were not monsters in the mythological sense. They were people who had been given permission to transgress every moral boundary, and who discovered that transgression could become addictive, could become identity, could become a kind of terrible freedom. They created a culture where cruelty was not just permitted but required, where the ability to kill without hesitation was proof of loyalty and strength, where every act of violence reinforced the ideology that justified it. And they did it all while claiming to be defenders of civilization, of Christianity, of Croatian national destiny. They attended Mass. They married and had families. They sent letters home describing their work in euphemistic terms that disguised murder as patriotic duty. They were not psychopaths in the clinical sense. Most of them were probably psychologically normal before the war. But they entered a system that rewarded cruelty and punished mercy, and they adapted. They transformed. They became what the system needed them to be. When we study history's darkest chapters, we usually find explanations that help us maintain distance. The Nazis were ideologues implementing a systematized evil. The Soviets were caught in a totalitarian machine that consumed its own children. The colonial massacres were products of dehumanizing racism and resource extraction. These explanations are true, but they also comfort us. They suggest that extreme evil requires extreme circumstances, specific ideologies, particular historical moments. The Ustashe challenged that comfort. They were not particularly ideological in the Nazi sense. They were not building a 1,000-year Reich or a communist utopia. They were simply given power and permission, and they discovered that some people, perhaps many people, perhaps most people under the right circumstances, can learn to enjoy cruelty. Can learn to find meaning in it. Can learn to build their entire sense of self around the capacity to inflict suffering. The reports filed by German officers, those documents that described their Croatian allies with such evident horror, are not really about the Ustashe. They're about us. They're about what humans are capable of when the normal constraints collapse. The German officers who filed those reports were themselves participating in genocide. They had already crossed moral boundaries that should have been uncrossable. But they maintained certain forms, certain procedures, certain justifications that let them believe they were soldiers rather than murderers. The Ustashe stripped away those forms and revealed what was underneath. Pure violence. Pure cruelty. Pure transgression transformed into identity. Today, In the former Yugoslavia, in Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia, the legacy of the Ustashe remains contested and painful. Jasenovac is a memorial site, but it's also a political battleground where different ethnic groups argue over victim counts and historical narratives. Some Croatian nationalists minimize or deny the atrocities. Some Serbian nationalists inflate them for political purposes. The truth sits somewhere in between, documented in testimony and archives, but still difficult to fully acknowledge. And beyond the Balkans, the Ustashe remain largely unknown. They don't have the name recognition of the Nazis or the Khmer Rouge. There are no major Hollywood films about Jasenovac. The history books mention them briefly, if at all. Most people have never heard of Ante Pavelić or Vjekoslav Ljuburik or the Srbosjek knives. The death cult that made Nazi officers file horror reports to Berlin has been largely forgotten. But forgetting is dangerous. Because what happened in Croatia between 1941 and 1945 was not unique in its fundamental dynamics. It was unique in its specific details, in its intensity, in the peculiar way it combined religious mysticism and ethnic hatred and bureaucratic power. But the underlying pattern, people given permission to transgress, people discovering meaning in cruelty, people transforming murder into ritual, that pattern appears again and again throughout history, in different places, in different forms, but always recognizable. We study these histories not to feel superior to the perpetrators, but to understand how ordinary people become monsters. Not through some supernatural transformation, not through possession by evil spirits, but through social systems that reward cruelty and punish mercy, through ideologies that provide justification for the unjustifiable, through the simple and terrible discovery that violence can feel empowering, can feel righteous, can feel like freedom. The German officers who filed those reports to Berlin were trying to warn their superiors that something had gone wrong in Croatia, that their allies had crossed a line even by the already abysmal standards of World War II. But they didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that there was no line. There was only what people were willing to do, and what they could get away with. The Ustashe simply revealed that truth more clearly than anyone else in that terrible time. The photographs remain. The testimony remains. The mass graves remain. The ruins of Jasenovac remain. And the questions remain. Questions about human nature, about cruelty, about how quickly civilization can dissolve, about what happens when people stop pretending to be good and embrace the terrible freedom of being openly monstrous. These are not comfortable questions. They don't have comfortable answers. But they are questions we must continue to ask, continue to sit with, continue to struggle against, because the alternative is forgetting. And forgetting is how it happens again.